I want to start off by giving a trigger warning to anyone who may be watching this video. The multi-part series you're about to see may contain triggering content about domestic violence, sex trafficking, and abuse. If you are someone who is sensitive to this type of material, please take care of your mental health first and refrain from watching the video. Also, if you are someone who is in a situation right now and needs help, please refer to the bottom of this video for resources and information on how to help you. I pray that you find the help and healing that you need. So let's get into today's content. What exactly is sex trafficking? Sex trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery in which individuals perform commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or even coercion. It pertains to so much more than what I knew, so much more than what I could have imagined. I thought that sex traffickers were people who would stalk people, pull up in a white van and kidnap them, haul them off somewhere into some dungeon or some dirty hotel room and force them to have sex with random people. But I learned so much. I learned that there are many different types of trafficking. It does not always happen that way. Jaimee Johnson is a lived experience expert on domestic sex trafficking. I got the opportunity to sit down and have an open discussion with her about her experience. What she has to share will shock you.
So like a lot of us, I come from childhood trauma starting very early. Both my parents are active in my life, but were never married. Wasn't like a 2-parent household. I was bounced back and forth a lot. There was alcoholism in my family, immediate family. There was a lot of domestic violence, not between my parents, but in outside relationships that they had. Gambling issues. We suffer from that, that old generational cycle of where you kind of just sweep things under the rug. We don't really talk about things. We don't really address the traumas or the issues that are coming up. Why we need to talk about that? We don't. And a lot of that stemmed from, in order for me to talk about where my healing has to come, I also have to be willing, the other people around me have to be willing to take their part and their accountability within my story, right? And vice versa. So a lot of times we avoid those things. And so growing up, I had middle child syndrome very badly. I was the middle child, older sister, younger brother. My older sister, we didn't grow up together. She moved out of the household at 13, 14, due to a lot of different circumstances, mainly the domestic violence that was going on. When I was 6, 7-ish, I was, to my recollection, first molested by somebody in the household. And, naturally that created in me a block. I didn't know it was a block. I didn't know that was trauma. I didn't know what was happening. I was so young, but very early on, I learned how to be manipulative. I learned how to seek attention negatively because negative attention was better than no attention. Right. So that's what I attached to. And my identity lied in trying to fit in, to gain that attention that I was so craving, just finding a place. It wasn't necessarily attention. It was just finding something that I was good at, finding something where people could think of they're like, oh, Jaimee, she's great at da-da-da. I didn't stick to anything. My brother was great at sports and he was a younger one. He was the baby. He was cute and oh, everybody loves him. My sister was gorgeous and she was the model and she was a gymnast and she did a lot of things and they had their identities within the things that they were doing. And I felt like I got lost somewhere in translation. So about 14-ish, getting at my freshman year in high school, that's when I started realizing that I could gain attention from boys. And I had my first boyfriend, and became sexually active without any awareness around sex equals babies. I didn't know that. I didn't even know about my body. No one had ever taught me about my period, nothing, So it was just kind of scrounging around in the dark, shuffling around in the dark, trying to figure it out for myself. And our relationship turned into domestic violence very early. He had his own mental health issues that he was 14 as well, were not being addressed. Right. Again, lots of childhood trauma, just unaddressed. And so we fought like really fought, like kicking each other downstairs and choking each other and just all types of crazy stuff that we shouldn't have been doing. But to me, that was normal in a lot of ways. Yeah. And as long as you apologize and say how much you love me and how sorry you are, it's okay. Right. And vice versa. It wasn't just him doing it to me. I was doing it back. So it's like, as long as I tell you I'm sorry, that means that I still love you. Mm-hmm. And I don't need to have any change behavior in order for me to say that I'm sorry. Right. So I ended up getting pregnant. Basically, I had an abortion. The only person that knew was my dad at that time. And we didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about it. I didn't go to counseling. I didn't, I think right an hour after I had my abortion, I went to play at my softball game. And that probably wasn't the healthiest thing to do. Yeah. Not just physically, but emotionally. So again, no real lack of mentoring, right? Like lack of just somebody telling me and giving me guidance. And so at 15, I broke up with this young man and I met a guy who was 27. And to me, again, nobody's telling me that that's a pedophile. Like this older man likes me, like, hey, I'm just thinking I'm grown. And he lived in my apartment complex. So it was easy for me to go to the pool or go to his house and say I was at my friend's house or whatever. Many years later, actually a few years ago, I realized through a trigger that my blackout, I had disassociated completely with my relationship with him. I remembered his face and I remembered his name, but I did not remember like the 2.5 months that we were together. Come to find out, that was my first experience with trafficking. He was drugging me when I would go to his house, not to where I was I don't think I was unconscious because I had to go home at some point, but there were things being done to me by his friends. And he was getting drugs and money in exchange for those that were not, I didn't know were happening. And, our bodies protect us, like our minds protect us. And I completely had blanks of that time with him. And so one day he just disappeared. He was just gone one day. And so I kind of moved on and not knowing that all of this stuff was trauma adding up and just kind of trying to still seek love in different places. I met my daughter's father at 16. Him and I, again, being stupid, having unprotected sex. I got pregnant again and remembering the feelings that came with the abortion. I was like, yeah, I'm not doing that again. I don't want to do that. And so I ended up becoming a mother at 17. I dropped out of high school. Again, lack of guidance because somebody could have told me, hey, there's other options. But instead, we're just like, hey, sign this paper and you could drop out. And I'm like, okay. I got sent to a secondary school from my normal high school to try to raise my credits up so that I had a chance to graduate, which was impossible. They're like, you need 90 credits in 3 months. And I'm like, how do you even do that? Is that even a possibility? I'm like, can I just drop out? Plus being 7 months pregnant, sitting in this class with people throwing spitballs and cussing and just extra. I'm like, I'm moody, I'm hormonal. I don't want to be here. So can I just leave? And they were like, yeah, if you want. I said, okay, so I'm out of here. So, the father and I stayed together. He had his own journey that he had to leave. He was supposed to be a basketball in college on a basketball scholarship. He changed that and joined the military. And we started our family. And from that point, we moved into like military housing. Everything was kind of cool for a little bit. I got pregnant again with our second daughter at 19. So we decided like, hey, we're supposed to get married. Like that's what we're supposed to do. So we did. So I was married by the time I was 19, 2 kids. We had a up and down relationship being in the military. He was gone a lot. He was constantly deployed. So I was basically like a single mom. Come to find out he was having an affair. Come to find out more, he was having an affair with a man. Like I clearly haven't been taught how to address things that bother me. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, we were kind of more really good friends anyways through our whole relationship. So I'm like, look, whatever you got going on, like we just need to take care of these kids. But I think he internally didn't know how to process what he was realizing was his reality, you know?
Right.
And so he dipped out and he left. And so now I was a single mom with 2 kids. Thankfully, I had a home still because we lived in military housing. But up until that point, you know, I had been recreationally using drugs, like pills when I wanted to go out, drinking pretty often. And I was in a position where like he was, the rent was paid because we had BAH, but everything else, he had switched the money over, the deposit over to his account. So I lost my job. I really was in a position where I was disconnected with my family because I didn't want them to be able to be like, yeah, we told you so. Just again, lack of guidance, and just trying to figure it out on my own. So let's see what happened. So I kind of got into the space of like the world owes me. Like I didn't get to live my teenager years out because I've been working. I was a mom. Like I'm about to go out and I'm about to have fun. I'm about to have my first one night stand and all this, just whatever. I'm about to get faded. And so that's what I did. I went to the club with my homegirl. It was her birthday. And I, not knowing I had all this emotional just junk, like all just in me. Right. So went out and I'm like, I'm going to find a boy and I'm gonna go home with him and I'm gonna sleep with him. Never had done that before. And I just thought that's what people do. So that's what I did. And met a guy at the club. And when I'm drunk, you know, I talk a lot when I'm sober, but when I'm drunk, like I'm gonna tell you my whole life story, and probably yours too. So I'm like telling this guy, you know, like, oh, you're cute, like I like you. And he's like, yeah, I like you too. He was faded, told him my whole situation, right? Told him I got kids at home, you know, my husband is left and blah, 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 blah. And basically at this point handed him my vulnerabilities and what he could fulfill in me on a platter. So made it pretty easy for him. And, you know, I want to note that like this man was not just some predator. He was my age, from the same area as I was. And, you know, maybe we'll talk about this a little more outside of my story, but something that I really am passionate about is understanding the dynamics of social grooming and societal grooming and the way media and hip hop culture and rape culture and all of these things play an intricate part in why people make choices that they do. And this young man was not even 21 either. And he was just doing what he thought he was supposed to be doing. So it wasn't like he was preying on me. It wasn't the same situation as that 27-year-old who was drugging me purposely to get something in return. This was more of a like, hey, you're struggling, I'm struggling, let's do this. And I want to just make sure that that's understood, not to justify anything that this person did, but to have understanding in how people get to the point that they do. Everyone has a story, everyone. And that doesn't make what they do right or wrong, but that does mean that if we take time to understand their story, that we can then maybe figure out how do we intervene earlier to prevent them from making these decisions. So I met him and, you know, we talked and we slept together. And the next day, you know, he was like, yeah, I really want to help you take care of your daughters. And like, I really like you. I think we could really build. He's like, but we're about money around here. And I'm like, are you a drug dealer? I'm like, because I, at this point, had no idea that the life of pimping and prostitution existed. Zero, none, never been exposed to it. Right. So I'm like, this fool wants me to sell drugs. Like, I'm not with it. Like, it is what it is. So I told him, don't call me, like, leave me alone. But, you know, a week later, when I still couldn't find a job, my fridge was getting a lot less full. I couldn't really even get to job interviews because I had a car, but I didn't have no gas to put in the car. So that $1,000 a night that guy promised me started to sound better and better. And at this point, my mind shifted back into whatever I have to do to take care of my kids, whatever I have to do, not only to take care of my kids, but also not go to my family and be like, hey, I'm struggling. Because I didn't know how to do that because we don't talk about things like that in my family. I called him and I was like, hey, you know, whatever. He's like, all right. Like, I'm like, hey, I'm down for whatever you were talking about. Still didn't know what he was talking about. He's like, okay, cool. Like, get dressed really sexy. Like, we're going to go out. So I'm like, oh, hey, we're about to go to the club. Like, we about to go on a date. I'm like, that's cool. I go to pick him up and he takes me, we're on the freeway and he's like, exit here. And, anybody who's watching that's familiar with San Diego, there's a street called El Cajon Boulevard, which is like an old school track blade prostitution area. It's where the pimps and the hoes, make their money. And everybody knows that. And I didn't know that, but he knew that. And so he's like, exit here. And he's like showing me all these streets. And I'm like, yeah, okay, cool. Why are you showing me these streets? Like, where's the club at? And he's like, all right, park. And I'm like, okay. And so at this point, my heart starts beating and I'm like, what's happening?
Right.
I'm in a little hoochie little red dress with some white heels on. He gives me some condoms and he's like, don't talk to no black guys. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, if any Mexican or white dude pulls over and they got at least $100, do what they ask you to do and then bring me the money back. And I'm like, what? Come again? Like, hold on. Can you repeat that? And in that moment, I realized I had no idea who this man was, right? Like at that moment, I remember feeling like flushed and like, okay, my daughter's like, he knows where I live. He knows like, what did I just get myself into? When he could tell I was nervous, I felt like, and this could have been through my perception of domestic violence as a younger child, I felt like I seen something in him shift. Like I seen like bitch, what? Like, you're not about to tell me no. And you're not about to waste my time. And so in that moment, I just was like, okay. And so I got out the car. And from that point, my whole life completely changed at that point.
To find out more about how this story unfolds, head on over to part 2.